Yeah, so everybody, welcome to the afternoon session of the second day of our UX at Scale conference, which of course is sponsored by our platinum sponsor Atlassian as well as our gold sponsor Salesforce. It's because of sponsors like them that we can continue doing these events and opening them up to the public free of charge. So we're very grateful to them. And as you might have heard in previous sessions, Atlassian is currently hiring for their design team of almost 200 at this point in their Mountain View as well as their Sydney office. And this design team is focused on building powerful experiences for Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, and all of the other Atlassian products, which are now over a dozen. And they have a really mature design process, actually. If you were able to join our webinar yesterday with Alistair, and talked about their process. So I've dropped a link in there if you're curious at all to check that out. And Salesforce, of course, is our gold sponsor, and they have a very mature design process as well. And they also have an excellent Medium publication that reveals the processes and the tactics that they use to design at scale in the enterprise. It's pretty detailed. It's a good resource, so I would recommend everybody to check that out as well. And with that being said, all the sessions are going to be recorded and sent to folks next week. So you will have that on hand for reference. And I will pass this over to Laura and she can get it started.
Great. Thanks so much, Jerry. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today and taking the time. Really look forward to talking with you and hearing some of your questions. So as Jerry said, I'm Laura Granka. I'm a director of UX at Google, and more specifically, I lead our UX research teams across Search and Assistant. So what I'll be telling you about is a bit of my history at Google. I've been at Google about 13 years, and so tips from scaling UX teams as we've grown tremendously in that time, and 7 lessons learned, and then hopefully have enough time for Q&A at the end. Great. So a little bit about me. I have a background in academia, actually, as a lot of UX researchers who got into the field maybe 10, 15 years ago have a PhD. What do we do? I don't know. Go to industry. And so try to figure this thing out in industry. And so I first got exposed to UX actually as an intern at Google in 2004. And at that time at Google was user experience researchers were actually called usability analysts, and there was 3 of them. And so a much smaller team. Basically, we would kind of sit around a room and say, who wants to work on this project this week or this project another week, anything from Blogger to search. So it was quite a different type of structure. It was very nascent early on. And anyway, this is sort of my journey and timeline. I'll just pull out a couple of key points from this, which is, around 2006, as Google UX grew, we changed from usability analysts to user experience researchers. And now that probably seems an obvious shift as we think about the field of UX today. But at the time, it was actually pretty significant in terms of, and a very significant reframing for the function within Google, framing from more of a usability analyst to actually user experience professionals and researchers. At that time, we were still one big team. So again, everybody within UX reported into kind of the same organization. And it was a bit more of a service model because we weren't so specialized. Over time, that did change, and so Google UX teams now report into, we have specific project areas. So right now, I'm responsible for Search and Assistant. There's another UX team responsible for, say, YouTube, and another UX team responsible for ads, etc. I've been managing UX teams since 2011, a variety of different teams. First, whether it was social, photos, Hangouts, those Google products. And then about 3 years ago, I took on some of our teams that span across all of Google and Alphabet, which is in terms of our research infrastructure and tooling. And that actually really got me interested in thinking about how the function scales. So specifically thinking about what tools and capabilities and infrastructure do we need to put in place to enable researchers and UXers and product teams as a whole to do better work. And then today, of course, as I mentioned, I lead up our UX research teams as director of UX for Search Assistant, as well as a couple of targeted innovation teams that I'll be talking to you a bit about shortly, which are some examples of how we've kind of piloted some successes and scaled forward. So again, just to quickly recap, then at Google, when I first started, there were essentially two functions, designers and researchers, and very small numbers of both of these individuals, and very central hiring criteria for both of these folks. I think researchers and designers, we had to be expected to have some coding proficiency. But now if you look at UX teams, the UX functional expertise has has expanded. So we don't just have one type of designer and one type of researcher. We have visual designers, motion designers, UX engineers, and different types of researchers. So we are able to be much more effective with with more specialized expertise instead of the general hiring bar that we had before. And then I'll talk a little bit more about how hiring strategies and tactics have actually shifted over the years too. So again, as I mentioned, I do UX research. And so what is UX research? A lot of you already probably know. And so I've just put a Wikipedia definition on up here. In terms of research, focuses on understanding user behaviors, needs, motivations, ultimately to understand how to influence our product development and product design. So with that, I won't go into too much of these basics, but while this is a definition, in reality, we know it's all fine and good to have a definition of what the function is, but in reality, what it really comes down to is I think researchers really need to be 1/3 product managers, 1/3 quite good at marketing, and then actually 1/3 of it is maybe the research itself. And so I know this is maybe a little bit more of a controversial view, but in terms of in reality and in practice, what really matters to the business and the function, especially when you think about scaling and having such an impact across the company, I think these three things play a big role. And so that's where I'll tell you a little bit more about how 7 lessons I've learned kind of framed in those 3 dimensions of what I see the job as. So first, if we think about product management, sorry if I'm getting some messages from work here. So product management is 1/3 of the job. If you don't understand the business, you really don't understand. It doesn't matter what work you do if it's not directly tied to anything else. So ultimately, all of us as UXers, we're here to build great products. So we all do that in different ways based on our unique skills and expertise. So for example, researchers do this specifically by partnering with teams throughout the entire product development process. Everybody, as we build things together, we're trying to figure out what to build, how to build it, and ultimately, did it work? So researchers have unique methods and tools to approach this at the early stage. What to build? Are we defining the right concepts? Are we iterating on the right types of things? Are we doing usability studies, prototypes, tests, and then evaluating, did we do a good job? We have a standard toolkit of methods in which we do that. And again, I'm really happy to talk about any of these types of methods in Q&A. I will get into some of them, but again, as this isn't as a primer about what UX research is, feel free to ask any questions later on. But again, the methods you may be familiar with already, typically usability sessions, interviews. We can do those remote, on campus. Desk research, what's really important is actually making sure that you do enough research up front before you actually kick off an expensive research program, making sure you do the right amount of work up front in terms of literature reviews, what's already been done and out there. Let's look at competitive analysis and see if there are some things we can learn from there. And then also, it's not everything needs a user test. A lot of things can be done with some expert reviews. And then we also have methods in terms of more longitudinal work, in terms of going into people's homes, seeing our products used in context, and over time, looking at surveys as well. Great. So lesson 1, I alluded to earlier, we have all of these methods and we have all of these tools, but ultimately, how are they made most impactful to the business? So specifically, I mentioned we went from a service organization to being much more embedded into product. And that really shifted a number of the things we've done. So if we were a service organization, researchers really had no time to come up to speed in terms of what unique project they were working on for that week. When we were literally all sitting around a conference room table and raising our hands, who wants to work on this week or this next week, you don't have the familiarity with the product as much as those product team members do. And similarly, you don't have the ability to either follow through nor necessarily as much motivation to follow through and make sure the research findings are translated effectively to the product. It's much more in and out in service. And while that may seem fine initially, because you're thinking, look, I just got to get a number of quick things done. Let's just bang out a couple of these usability tests for this and that. That's going to work now. It will not enable you to scale effectively and have as much impact as you want the product to have. One case study that we've talked a bit about before is regarding Google's elections and civics products. So this was actually kind of interesting because if you think about elections and you think about typical tech companies wanting to launch and iterate, you can't as easily iterate with an election because there's an election day. And so what you launch on that day, it's pretty important that you get it right that day. You can learn a number of other things along the way, but this is where it really is important to work with the product team up front in terms of making sure we're delivering the best thing that we possibly can. So this actually started a bit back in terms of wanting to get, looking at how are people motivated to get civically engaged. And so looking at people who are interested in politics and the government and things around them, but just are, for whatever reason, not getting involved. And so research identified a couple of these key things in terms of people being too busy, they don't know what to do, they feel they won't have any impact. And so this really enabled the team to shift and think about solving these three cases. Because initially, if you could think about it, there's an election day, let's launch an elections experience. We may just want to focus on the tallying of the results on that one specific day. But that would actually miss out a lot of the key user needs and motivations that are actually pretty important throughout this journey. So that enabled us specifically to look at the whole journey for the general election. People want to be able to figure out how to get engaged, how to vote, specifically what's on their ballot locally. How can we help people understand some of these things, like what is a comptroller? You don't quite understand how all of these things might matter to them, and giving some more context around that in our product. So things like this enabled us to be much more effective in terms of figuring out what to build and building the right thing up front, just because we had a researcher working with the team for a significant period of time, rather than coming in and out and just sort of testing something like, hey, does that map of election results make sense to people? So that was one in terms of from the service model to embedding and really enabling and that requires working with teams to prioritize and make sure that you understand, look, if we're going to focus on these things, we're going to do it really well. And so that's where there is definitely a lot of negotiation and discussion with the UX team as well as the product team to help focus. Another thing we did was actually invest early in infrastructure to make sure that we are able to do the right types of work that help our business scale and go where we want to be going. So if you might think about it, and there were a couple of key things that we would look at. So a lot of tech companies are based in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. And so, but we want to understand where the business is headed. That global users, it was pretty important that we do enough work globally and not just based in some of the tech hubs and in the US. We also know that mobile certainly is quite important. If I think back to when I joined Google and I think about usability studies, they tended to be in like some really dark room with a desk and a desktop computer and a mouse and maybe a one-way mirror, and a lot of the things happen there on that computer, right? But a room like that and an infrastructure set up like that doesn't help us get to where we want to go in terms of looking at mobile opportunities, looking at things in context. And then we also feel that things that being agile, just being able to be responsive to where the business is trying to go and help provide information to key decisions when they need to be made is pretty important. Having long lead times is not always okay. So we did a couple of things in each of these dimensions. For example, in global, we've actually invested early with a pilot program, which is now continuing to run with having some researchers based out of India, which helps us there with the international market. Similarly with mobile, we've invested in a number of tools and solutions that really help us to do the right type of work on mobile devices instead of just relying on usability labs. How are we right equipment to either record on mobile, get feedback from, making sure that our prototypes are mobile ready, and then as well as agile. This is one thing I wanted to speak a little bit more about because it reflects back to the first point of being embedded. But one team that I've kicked up is a team called Rapid Research. And so these teams are agile and specialized. So also if you think about the first point about being embedded, one of the things that's pretty important is if, sure, maybe you're working directly with one product team and you really know the domain and the space. If you spend 3 out of your 5 days a week in a usability lab or just running research, that takes away from some of the time that you could be spending with your product team, being involved in some of those product strategy conversations, really translating some of the research insights into the product roadmap and things like that. So obviously some time needs to be spent towards research, so not proposing to eliminate all of that, but trying to make sure that we maximize the time that is spent during research. So for a lot of these quick, well-defined research questions and usability questions, I have a specialized team of more junior researchers who can take on some of these requests across the broader suite of my team. So while my team covers a number of products across search and assistant and news and a number of things, this team can handle some of the more tactical things on a regular basis. So we have regular participants scheduled coming in each week and 1 week turnaround for some of these quick things. And that's ended up being really nice just to enable some more of the researchers to really keep that momentum with their product teams, but also be able to give quick insights back. So again, those first two things were sort of about understanding the business. So in order for you to do the right research, you need to have the right sense of product strategy and be working with your product partners to be even able to plan the right stuff up front by being embedded. And then similarly, making sure that you have sort of the right infrastructure such that researchers can spend time doing the research rather than calling and recruiting participants, worrying about, is this lab setup going to work, and what's going to happen there. So I think making sure that you invest early in infrastructure before you hit a lot of pain points later helps solve that. Great. So the second third of the job, this is where it gets fun in terms of thinking about, in terms of the research you do, it has to resonate with the business certainly. But then also what you do, doesn't matter what research you do if it doesn't quite land or if it's not taken up and the uptake isn't quite there with the rest of the company. You don't just want to send reports over the wall and have them be ignored. So this is where I really emphasize, at least with my teams, the importance of communication and delivery. So for example, there's a lot of research that we've done that's desk research that I alluded to earlier around like surveys, things like that around sports popularity and things like that worldwide. So if you think of Google's mission is to make the world's information universally accessible and useful. And so we have certain experiences in the US. You might imagine if you search for basketball scores, football scores, sports scores, you see a tally, you see the game, you see all of these details in the English US experience. And so as we try to think about, okay, what do we do for other markets? One of the obvious things is, okay, maybe we just port that same exact thing elsewhere to every other country. But then, the other angle of that is, well, okay, what unique experiences can we certainly deliver? And cricket in India was certainly a big one. And everybody knows cricket in India is big. It's very popular. And so you can read any number of surveys and you can see any number of reports on the internet about how popular cricket is. However, when we took that product team to India, understanding how sports play a role in people's lives, understanding of what sports actually are popular, but also just understanding and seeing everybody on the street playing cricket like this, or also seeing things like how or workarounds that people have if they're not able to watch a live cricket match, what workarounds you have to get kind of as real-time updates as is possible, really help the team think differently about the sports experience there. It wasn't just about presenting and showing a tally of the sports scores, but there were certainly some unique things that we could do related to some of the unique needs in India. And so that kind of gets to this point around like seeing is believing. We've done a number of reports and research findings, but if the team isn't engaged to watch it, it doesn't always resonate as much as it could. And this isn't a new lesson. This is things that people have talked about in the UX field for 15 years. Having a weekly lunch where product teams can observe a user interacting with a product, just having a regular cadence and opportunity for people to interact with users is one of the, is certainly fundamental. But we've done this in a number of creative ways at Google because while it would be great for everybody to watch a usability study, and certainly many teams regularly do that, there are probably some other different ways where we can engage our team members in the business with actual users using our products. So we've tried a couple of different efforts. One we've called Poker Face. We've talked about publicly, but that's really about researchers training our product engineers and product managers on how to actually run a research study, which is quite humbling for many people and also quite inspiring just to see the differences in the delta and what they might perceive. We've also done a study called Urban Jungle, which is essentially doing what I've referred to with sports in India, taking people out into contexts that they might not be familiar with. For example, maps. Driving directions in a car is quite popular, of course, in the US because a lot of people in the US have cars and drive around. However, when you think about India, what's that commuting experience like? Are people driving cars? No, more people are driving scooters. So what's the two-wheeler experience like, for example? What is it like to be on a scooter during rush hour? Well, we can show you some of these things by experiencing that and being there and seeing what this context is actually like. We've also done a number of other things, speed chat, and it's kind of like speed dating for people using our products, where product team members can get a variety of touch points with a number of different types of people. And then one thing we've also done field days with the research van. So we've put a reusability lab essentially inside a research van, and we have driven it across the country. This has a couple of benefits. One is it certainly goes outside the tech bubble of where our offices are, and it even just going out an hour or two really helps in terms of getting a more diverse mix of people. But it also enables us to more easily go to any other region within the U.S. And it's for quick, lightweight stuff. And it's also an easier way for teams to travel than going on an international immersion trip. They can just go elsewhere in the U.S. So, and then similarly, the news team, they wanted to really understand, especially when it's related to local news. A lot of our Google's headquarters are in cities and very more urban areas. And so looking at kind of the news experience across and different regions, different demographics has actually been helpful, and they used our research van for that. So then when we're still talking about here having the message hit home, so it's one thing for our product team members to actually see and experience things themselves, but the storytelling actually matters as well, because not everybody may be fortunate enough to observe something, but you still want that message to hit home. And so one of the things we've invested in is a communication design team, which actually enables researchers to get some advice and help in terms of crafting that message. For me as a researcher, for example, it might take me longer to figure out how to make my presentation look good, and then try to figure out if my storyline is compelling enough. So we have a couple of designers. It's a small, lean team with that actually help with a number of other things like that. And even if there's no dedicated communication design team, just thinking about how some of your existing design staff could potentially just take an hour or two a week for something like an office hours, which helps tremendously for researchers to sort of walk through some of the key findings, help translate findings to insight, help you just help craft the story in terms of a presentation. And then other things that we've invested in is just having simple templates for posters and presentations, take all the guesswork out of it. And so have really beautiful slide templates that a few researchers can add content to, so that they don't spend as much time trying to think about like what's the right display of information, what should I think about here. And similarly, we've done things with video. You can't observe something firsthand. Video can be almost as good in terms of seeing highlights of this experience. And then Google, of course, as a bigger company, does offer more professional development in terms of presentation classes, but we've also targeted a couple of those more towards UX professionals in terms of how to tell a story, how to present the work. Even when you do field research or go in-home visits, if you're just taking a photograph of your app on somebody's phone in their living room and not understanding the broader context, you're not bringing as much richness back to your product team. So tips around things like that. Yeah. So now we can actually talk about the research. So we've got a couple of things covered, understanding where the business needs are and making sure that your research and UX teams can fit in that. And then similarly, understanding how to frame the work that you're actually doing in a way that resonates with product teams ultimately helps to scale because more people sense the benefit of that. And then in terms of the research itself, I alluded to this earlier, but being a little bit more creative about hiring. When I first started, again, I think the assumption was as UX was pretty new, like 13, 14 years ago. And so we kind of assumed, and it was probably a fine assumption for the time, that people with PhDs who can do research here in industry. That may be a fine assumption, but it's also one that needs to evolve over time. As you can see, the variety and the diverse things that researchers do in practice. And so, yes, then, it probably evolved from people in more formal HCI training with master's degrees in HCI. But even now, I think the suite of things we do, from looking at competitive analysis, doing survey research, looking at the broader landscape as we're trying to figure out what to build, it's not just the qualitative research, but it's understanding kind of this bigger market perspective. And so really being flexible enough and looking at your team as a whole and making sure you have people that represent each sort of different function that you might care about, whether it's someone with a more market perspective, somebody who's able to do a little bit more quant work from the traditional qualitative researcher. And yes, this is a photo from the internship movie, of course, which was filmed partly at Google. Then one of the other things we've learned in terms of research methods is piloting, but then being kind of persistent with some of our pilots. So, for example, I'll give you one case study that we looked at, but we care about making good user experiences that are we want them to be relatively predictable for people so that they know how to use them. And so avoid a mismatch between user expectations and design. So if you have a door that looks like a door, you kind of know what to do, you go inside. If you have a door that's kind of hidden in this brick wall and you don't know that it's really a door, maybe you might miss it, pass it by, you might not be sure what's behind it, and so you may be less likely to engage. And so we kind of actually took that metaphor and translated it to how we're thinking about some of our UIs across the board. So we had this question of, do people know what is tappable on the search page, for example? And so we thought, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We could ask people what they think is tappable. We could do this one-on-one. Then we thought, what, why don't we just print out a lot of pages of the search result page and just give people some markers and just see what they think is tappable on the page. And so you can see a whole bunch of highlights here. And that was fine. And so then we had researchers look at it and code this all up. And of course, that certainly takes some time. And it actually proved to be relatively interesting when we shared it back with our with our executive team. So that made us think, okay, look, there's an inordinate number of pages, not just on Google search, but our other properties. How can we kind of think about scaling this? So then we worked with an engineering team to sort of essentially do this more at scale, where we enabled people to do this and then give feedback directly to the system on a UI online. And then with this type of thing, we're able to sort of make sense of hundreds of different user perceptions and aggregate these things at scale. And so this was, again, just one example, but it's, if you go back from like pen and paper, highlighting things on a piece of paper, it could be tempting to just stop there and say, okay, yeah, we got some insights that we needed. But then in terms of thinking longer term, we're always going to be evolving a lot of our UI experiences. So how are we investing in a research method and approach that can help us scale over time? And so that's where it is kind of important to think about where are some of the areas you do want to invest and think long term for the future. And so that this wasn't just a one-off study, but it's actually something that we can now repeat over time. And then finally, one of the other things that really helps take some of the guesswork out of what research to do, or also getting buy-in from teams, is really just relying on shared frameworks. So this comes in handy quite a bit. One framework that's really easy to remember and also use, that's pretty comprehensive, is the HEART framework, where we look at happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. And so this is a helpful framing if you're trying to think about how to get engaged in research. What should a research program look like? What is going to be most impactful to the product team? You can think along these dimensions because they kind of take you through that life cycle of the foundational work, what to build, the iterative stage of are we building the right thing? Let's quickly test it, to finally evaluating, was it successful? So quickly take you through this. Happiness, essentially we're trying to look at moments of delight in our product. Are users happy when they're using our products? Is it satisfying for them? And so one of the things we've done in product is instrumenting product surveys, just to track user satisfaction and perceptions over time. And so this can be kind of handy, where you may have some specific things you want to in product survey to trigger on or show up on, or after an experience. You've probably all gotten these surveys after you use certain websites. It's tell us about your experience and rate your experience. Those things actually are kind of helpful, especially to track over time. One unit, one moment in time, a snapshot of how happy people is can only go so far. But then if you're able to look at over time, then you can see how that evolves with how you've evolved your product. So you can imagine it at week 0 here in this example, satisfaction is so much lower than it was before and after. So that helps the team take a cue and try to figure out, okay, what did we do at that time? What's going on there, and how can we improve? If you're not able to do things in your own product, then absolutely make use of any of this external data that's so readily available. There's so many press reviews, just kind of looking through what a lot of journalists these days are now looking at new tech products and kind of doing their own day in the life assessment of these products. That is totally fair game and should be used as much as possible, so you don't have to replicate everything. App and online product reviews, whether it's app and Play Store, looking at Amazon or any other online site where there's product reviews, actually really helps quite a lot just to understand what some of the feedback's about. Engagement. So when we think about people being engaged with your product, we're thinking about how much time do they spend and what do they actually do on your product. So there's a number of different ways we can do this. Again, kind of the first thing I'll tell you about is if you do in-product logging. That is kind of the more traditional way to look at engagement. And you can kind of create cool visualizations about this. So these circles are basically how much time people have spent on your product, on an example product doing certain things. So each bar, like this blue bar, for example, is each color ring is a visit. And then the visits that go out wider and longer are the visits that lasted longer. So you can kind of get a sense, oh, people who started in your product via this route frequently went to this route and that route and that route and stayed a much longer time than, say, people who just came in via this brown route on the side where you come in and you don't go anywhere else. So you can kind of look at things like that, just the sequences of behavior and how much time people spend in your product. But also, if you don't have in-product logging, we do things, other ways to assess how engaged people are with your product, and kind of what sort of emotional engagement they have as well. We've done certain things like, hey, use this product for a week, and then at the end of that week, write either a breakup letter or a love letter based on your experience. Do you want to break up with this product, or are you really in love with this product? And so this is obviously is a really short example, but we've gotten some really nice, pretty interesting bits of feedback there, especially when people want to, that explain why they may or may not be as engaged with our products as we would like. Great. The next adoption is essentially the pace of uptake. How quickly are people adopting your product? And as well as also maybe if you're doing competitive analysis products across the board. So certainly there's a ton of online external trends that you can stay up on. This is just obviously just one example. You can also track adoption within product logs, just to see, is this reaching the rate at which you might expect and to grow. And then with that, it's all fine and good to get new people to your product, but if you don't have people who want to keep using your product, that's where there's often a little bit of a challenge, right? So we also definitely look at retention. How do users come back to your product? How often? There's a picture of a toothbrush here because we have sort of one saying, the toothbrush test. And ideally, some products may want people to come back every day, just like you brush your teeth every day. And so how do we create habits out of some of the things that we're building? And there's a lot of research around that. So there's a couple of things like looking at this toothbrush test. Is this product needed on a daily basis? If it's not needed on a daily basis, you kind of figure out what cadence is your ideal retention. Do you want people to be checking in on a weekly basis? Is it hourly? How often do you want people to be coming back, and kind of see how you are with regards to that? So looking at in-product analysis. And again, if you don't have in-product logging, there's definitely things you can do here in terms of longitudinal work. This is where we've invested more in terms of diary studies, where we're able to ask people to, use something over a period of time and track, at the end of each day, the beginning of each day, or potentially in context. We can send them little, SMS or pings to let us know if they're continuing to use this and why or why not, and what they're doing. So having that can sometimes be a proxy if you don't have the end product capabilities. And then finally, looking at task success. This is probably the piece that a lot of UX professionals may be most familiar with in terms of understanding core usability and behavior, and can people do on your product what you want them to be able to do. So here's where we obviously do a number of the typical UX research methods. This is obviously just where someone's observing a study, trying to keep a poker face. People aren't doing the thing that you might expect. But we do a lot of observational work, usability work, all within the frame of kind of some core user journeys to make sure that we actually scope out in advance of time that we want people to be able to achieve these key things on our product, and can people complete that journey, whether it's in one session, over multiple sessions, kind of looking over time. And that's where some of those methods I referred to earlier, like using rapid research, or with the research ban and typical usability studies, investing in the right infrastructure to make sure that we can do that on mobile devices, internationally, things like that. Cool. Great, so that was a bit of a whirlwind, just 7 lessons learned. We're gonna have about 15 minutes for questions, I believe. But again, just to quickly wrap up, I think some of the key things that I've really learned at Google in terms of helping us scale is when we think about aligning with the business, shifting from the service to being embedded really helps us to do the right type of work at the right time. And then also investing early in infrastructure, making sure we anticipate where the business is going, whether there's more mobile solutions needed and more mobile research needed, whether it's international, or just investing in some of the right capabilities up front to make sure that we have the right tools and specialists to help us out. And then the second piece is largely around how are we positioning the research we do, whether it's from seeing is believing to helping the research resonate and generate empathy with our product teams for the challenges that our users are actually experiencing. And along with that, storytelling does matter. It's not just a matter of writing up a report and just all the facts in one document. It should resonate, and you should be able to sort of feel the challenges or pain points or opportunities in that. And so you can do that through video or just investing in some basic fundamentals of getting some design help for, office hours and feedback sessions. And then the last bit's, again, thinking about the composition of your research teams. If you have a small company and you have one researcher, sure, it's obviously not, you can't have a completely diverse team, but it's worth thinking about what skills are the most important to your business at the time. So for example, maybe a qualitative researcher who's really specialized in usability is right for right now as you're iterating on a lot of work. But if you're in the early stages, looking for someone who has traditional UX experience may not be the right thing. You might want someone who has more of a marketing perspective or a more business sense in terms of competitive analysis, survey background to understand sort of what's the product to market fit. So again, just think about what your current needs are and where you want to hire. It's not one size UX researcher should fit all. And then again, pilot and persist. If you have something that, how can you make processes repeatable over time? That's one thing we just don't want to have one-off studies, as few as possible. Are there ways we can extend the research that we do and have it impact multiple teams? Can we apply these methods to multiple areas? Make it a little bit more programmatic than just simply than just one-off research that can ultimately feel a little bit more throwaway. And then finally, rely on shared frameworks. There's so much to think about as you're building products. There's so many decisions to be making that if you have shared frameworks that are sort of agreed upon and people understand that these are the components involved, it really helps take a lot of the guesswork and planning out of the research that you do, and just relying on some core and shortcuts, essentially. How are we looking at engagement? How are we looking at retention, task success? Helps drive the product conversation forward. Cool. So now 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm sure there are a bunch of questions because I did go through a number of things, especially early on, relatively quickly. So yeah, look forward to hearing the questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Laura. And yes, we definitely have some great questions here.
Great.
I'll just make a few announcements here as we get into this. So we'll go ahead and launch a quick poll. And of course, we are sponsored by Atlassian and Salesforce in this event, and they really help make it possible and make it open and free to the entire design community. So like I mentioned in the beginning, Atlassian is hiring for their Mountain View and Sydney offices, and their design team works on powerful experiences for Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, and all of the Atlassian products. And if you're interested in checking out some of those open positions, here is the link down at the bottom. And of course, Salesforce also has a great Medium publication that talks about their design processes, and we recommend you check that out. And of course, we are UXPin, and we are a full stack UX design platform. So we help teams prototype, create their design system, generate documentation, and automate their developer handoffs all in one place. So if you're interested in checking that out, we do have a free trial, and I've dropped in our link down at the bottom. And let's dive into some of the questions. We've got some great questions here. So the first question is, when thinking about companies and scaling efforts, stakeholders tend to really rely on quantitative data. And so at Google, how do you also convince them of the value of qualitative data and in a way, kind of show that information in a compelling manner?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In some other talks and presentations I've given, it's Google has shifted a little bit, or at least I've noticed, from being notoriously data-driven to more data-informed. And that's not just a semantic switch. It is a little bit of a switch in terms of how the different types of information we present actually help people make decisions. So for a lot of these things now that we're doing, the qualitative element does actually help explain the why. So frequently we're seeing more and more metrics and quantitative data about what's actually happening, but all we have in some cases is guesses about why that's actually the case. So in the best ways, if you have a really quantitatively driven team, is to complement like the what's happening with the why, and really use the qualitative research to help understand the more user behavior, like the rationale behind the behaviors you're seeing.
Right.
Yeah.
And another question here on a related note is, at Google, how do you share your user research learnings across distributed teams? For instance, do you rely more on documentation and reporting, or is it, do you invite them into more sessions? What is kind of the tactic for bridging that gap?
That's a great question. Overall, like, I guess I'll take it to this uber distributed across like everybody at Google and Alphabet. We actually have one shared repository for all reports and anything that's ever been done for research called our research archive. And that's across like all of our products, YouTube ads, search, and stuff. And so that's actually helpful for teams to follow up if they miss stuff. But I think what you're saying is with distributed teams, like with your core team in multiple offices, not everybody can travel on a study. Not everybody is available at the same time in the same time zone to observe stuff. So what do we do? That's a great point. We're able to like stream our user sessions live, and anybody can dial in if they want to do that. But I think more broadly, that's where we often rely on kind of quick syncs either after the studies or the following day, just to do some quick check-ins and level sets. And that's also where we use a lot of video just to pull in a couple of key highlights. Oftentimes when we file bugs or we have some issues with some of the things, we often associate sort of a video clip or highlight from the study to showcase why this was actually a problem. And that helps a lot too. And we certainly do reports and presentations as well. We do document. While we may even do some quick iterative stuff and a formal report may not be necessary for the core team, we do at least some form of documentation across the board, just so that 6 months later we're like, what did we do 6 months ago? Okay, it's here in this report, and those artifacts are shared into distributed offices.
Right. And the next question here is around, let's see. The next question is really around the size of the research team. So could you explain a little bit more around how large is the research team today, and are they still in more of a centralized role, or do they embed into specific product teams?
Yeah, so research is embedded into specific product teams. And so, there's hundreds of researchers across all of Google. And then within my team, we do rely on a mix of full-time staff. We have some contractors if we're piloting some things, as well as using vendors for things. So we don't have like a one-to-one mapping for product managers. We try to ideally, or designers. Researchers are fewer in number than those teams, but we try to keep the ratio, at least with designers, around 1 to 3. It doesn't always work, obviously, but we're trying to do that just so that we can embed as much as possible. But my team in particular for search, it's like all of our search products, our search apps, things like the Google keyboard, as well as the assistant, including assistant on multiple devices. We have news. We have news on search. So, and then I have an international team, as well as the rapid research team. So all of those numbers together, there's certainly dozens and dozens across those product areas.
Got it. And would you say that those heart metrics is what the user research team uses mostly to measure their work, or do they also use objectives and key results?
Yeah, that's a great point. So Google as a whole, we do look at objectives and key results, we call them ARs. I would say it is a mix of both, because I would say kind of the company objectives in some way, like our business goals, drive what research we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. However, the heart metrics, I would say, is largely a little bit more about um, how we do it, though they often, but to some extent, those heart metrics also are the key results. So, for example, if we want to launch something, a key result may be that it has this much satisfaction, or that X many users are satisfied, or that people can actually complete their this critical journey. So we do define some of those journeys up front, which are embedded and baked into the objectives. So yeah.
Got it. And the next question is, um, are there dedicated developers who help the user research team to either code out prototypes or help them to build custom tools that they may need for user research?
Yeah, so we have one of the functions that I showed earlier on that kind of that big scatter plot I reference is what we call UX engineers. And so UX engineers help both research and design. I mean, they help our entire product development process, but that skill set of in that team does do prototypes for research studies, and they also do kind of and also as like product teams are trying to think about, instead of going beyond static mocks, to see how some things work. Um, though I think one of the things that, in thinking about scaling, instead of just like hiring all these functions, we do have some tools that enable more Wizard of Oz style prototyping. You can kind of click through mocks, and certain mocks will link to a next series of mocks. So we do some things like that too, which is like, it's hacky prototyping, but in sometimes it does work for research studies, and it doesn't take as much engineering time. So yeah, so anyway, short answer to your question, yes, we do have some dedicated staff that can help. They're not part of my research team, but they're part of our cross-functional UX team. But we also try to do as much as possible, scaling and sort of the right tools and infrastructure, such that we don't have to do one-off prototypes for everything.
Right. And as a follow-up question here, so somebody is actually, this is to a previous question, how do you share UX insights or user research insights with people at a executive level? So, for instance, do you use a certain format that you found resonates well with those folks?
Yeah, and I will say this actually does translate back to one of the questions before about the quantitative and qualitative. I would say 13 years ago at Google, the numbers were what mattered. But now, when in meetings with executives, actually research videos play a front and center role. It's quite incredible, not only the shift, but also just how much some of those it resonates to help some of these things hit home. Especially for Google, a lot of the problems we're trying to solve now, it's kind of new, uncharted territory. It may be new markets that our executives are not as familiar with. It may be new surfaces or devices. Expectations may be changing, and so so as a whole, we do deliver presentations. We do also often include video in these presentations to show how it's working. But then, as much as possible, we work with partner teams. If we don't have a quant researcher, then we partner with an analyst just to help us couch it in some more into the bigger perspective. Maybe in our qualitative work, we identified a couple of key trends, and we can back them up as well with external stats or with some of the in-product logs. I find that framing is often pretty important when you go to executive audiences, no matter whether it's a presentation or a video.
Right. And now we have a question around sample size. So in your work, how do you determine how many users need to be tested to get credible or actionable feedback? Is there a certain formula that is used at Google for that?
Yeah, we use, it depends on the different type of research question. Like for traditional usability work, if you're trying to figure out, can people complete this critical journey? Can people figure out how to do X, Y, Z with a product? does this flow make sense? Then we typically go by the usability numbers, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 8 folks. We tend to stick with that for the usability work. When we do, that may change or scale, if we have some more target personas that we're looking at, and we want to see maybe how some things differ across personas, whether personas may be parents or millennials or teenagers, then we would probably increase if we're doing some more foundational work, certainly across there. But for usability, that we stick with those general rules of them.
Gotcha. And let's see here. Next question we have is, so in your work, do you also follow a sprint-based process for research? So obviously, folks know Google pretty well for the design sprints, but is there also a research sprint process that the researchers will follow?
That's a great question. I wish we had a formal research sprint process. Like we do sprint-like things certainly up front, especially as we do kickoffs. That's where we get kind of a lot of the, and research plays a pretty critical role in all of the design sprints that people are probably familiar with in terms of a lot of the planning up front, where we get a lot of their literature, what's the market opportunity, the external research, and some synthesis of what we know about this topic domain. So we definitely do research going into some of the sprints. In terms of trying to solve problems, we do focus on some sprint-like elements when planning out research. So certainly collaboration, like you get so many great ideas in sprint with multiple people. And for bigger research projects, we absolutely do that. We do a lot of collaboration and get feedback from multiple people and spend enough time kind of doing the due diligence and thinking up front. And then kind of sharing out and getting feedback early. We do some of that too. It's great. If anybody else has done kind of a research sprint process, would love to hear about it. Just email me.
Cool. The next question is, so when you saw user research first being expanded and formalized at Google, did you experience any challenges in terms of getting buy-in from product or engineering folks? And if you did, what did you find was useful in terms of getting that buy-in and then integrating more deeply with those teams?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because especially as UX research was fairly new, people didn't always realize what the value was. So part of it is a lot of case studies, and some of those case studies did come from being embedded and having other product teams and other designers and engineers speak about the value of the work. So it often helps. And yeah, selling research, it's often best when somebody else does the selling for you and explaining why they really need you and your function to help. So we certainly had a lot of strategic early partners in that. And then also just in terms of framing the work we do, it's not providing it more as like a value add throughout the process was helpful, showing kind of the diversity of things we could do and shifting away. And that's where the name change did help as well, from usability analysts to user experience researchers. It's not just one type of work, but it is certainly a bit more varied.
Got it. And the next question is, so Google, many years ago was traditionally engineering driven, and that has changed quite a bit over time. Now at Google, would you say that designers have the same sort of level of authority and expertise as product managers and engineers, or does the conversation usually always start with product managers and then kind of populate outwards from there?
It's a good question, and it really does differ by each product area. Like, as I mentioned, we now have UX teams in all different parts of the company. And I would say that's where, one of the nice things is it is varied. We have some teams that have been around for a long time, like Search, who are really familiar with all functions of UX. And then we have some newer teams or new pilot, start projects that are quite newer. And so, and they all kind of have varying ways of engaging with the product teams. So as much as I do say that it is generally a joint conversation up front, but it really does depend by the area within Google.
Gotcha. And the next question we have is, let's see.
I
So
think.
are these, the next question, we'll take two more since we're coming up on the end of the hour. The next question is around the embedding of researchers in product teams. So are these researchers like permanently embedded in a team, or do they just kind of come and go as they need, and they embed in different teams for different lengths of time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right. You want to be flexible enough to kind of rebalance your staffing and not be stuck with something like for perpetuity. So we do look at priorities, but at least like on a quarterly basis. So I don't, it's not that conducive to be shifting people more than that. Frequently, people are on projects for multiple quarters, sometimes multiple years. So it really does depend, but on kind of the priorities. So that's where I'll work with kind of our other directors and VPs to make sure that we're aligned on like what are the right projects, and also making sure we get in early. Like, hey, we're trying to kick off a couple of new initiatives. Some of those may be high priority for research to be involved in, and so then we can kind of shift resources there. But if you're trying to engage in some more like early stage formative work, then you really, your engagement has to be a bit longer as you really work with a product team through some of those solutions. So yeah, so it generally lasts so it lasts at least a quarter, but we do evaluate to make sure we're aligned with the priorities.
Gotcha. And the last question that we will take here is, let's see here. So there was a few questions around, could you talk a little bit about how user research interacts with analytics teams, or if there is that sort of interaction where they may work with a data analyst and to try to synthesize that data, or are those researchers kind of acting as the data analysts themselves?
Yeah, great. So Google is big enough where we do have analyst teams, and what's been really interesting in the collaborations between research and analysts is sort of the different perspective that we are able to provide on the data. So we do collaborate together, not for every single project, but for some of the key cases where it does matter, where we're able to look at some of the qualitative data, put it in light of some of the analytics that we're seeing. But then also look at, why we might be seeing, and also thinking differently about some of the success metrics. If we're seeing some types of signal in logs, how can we use kind of our understanding of user behavior to work with and collaborate with the analyst to sort of shape, like, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Especially for things we've never launched or tried before. You don't quite know what success looks like in the logs. You know what success looks like in your head, where hey, this product is successful if we can achieve this, but you may not always know how that translates back to the metrics. And so we do some work up front with the analyst team defining some of those success metrics based on what kind of behaviors we'd like to see. And so it's a bit of both, sometimes up front before launch, and then afterwards just sort of making sense of what is in the data.
Right. Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And that is the last question that we will actually take here. Thanks everybody for joining and coming with such great questions. I think we had almost 700 people here at a certain point. So there's a lot of folks who came out and were really interested in what you had to say, and they really enjoyed the presentation. So yeah, thanks a lot, Laura, for joining us here.
Of course. Thanks so much for the invitation. Great. And of course, any questions, feel free to email me or otherwise get in touch. And yeah, thanks so much for attending and for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all the folks that are here, the next session starts at 2 p.m. So we have a little bit of time here. Let me include the Zoom URL if you want to go ahead and if you want to just join early or whatever. There is the Zoom URL for the next session, which starts in about 25 minutes. Otherwise, yeah, thanks for joining, everybody. Great job, Laura, and take care. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care.
All right. See ya.